Moving on to reasons for terminating tests. To terminate a test, there must be things in place and factors affecting it. Such factors can be contraindications from health screening, that's if there is one, extreme exhaustion, shortness of breath or difficulty, excessive blood pressure, so 220 systolic over 115 diastolic, irregular heartbeat, client's request to stop, that's the right to withdraw, cramp or pain, and equipment failure. As we can see, there are two reasons that the researcher in the scenario should have stopped the testing. The client clearly stated that they didn't want to continue with the exercise, and also they must have been visibly exhausted as they fell off the back of their equipment when getting off. This shows a neglection for the reasons to stop testing by the researcher. This means that because the boy didn't want to carry on and suffered an injury, it was likely he would bring illegal action against the researcher. This in turn may mean the researcher loses their BASES accreditation, is sued for the injury under their watch, has to be supervised on other tests. So the other tests they do because they cannot be trusted to conduct proper safety procedures. Moving on to researcher responsibility. The researcher has the responsibility to protect the participants and anticipate any ethical issues before the study. Monitor the participant, competence and data handling. As we can see, the participant was not protected during the session, and there was an injury to the participant because of their lack of care taken by the researcher to enforce the proper safety procedures for health and safety. This can have implications for the participant. Obviously, they've sustained an injury because the procedures weren't in place, and the researcher wasn't taking responsibility, as he denied him right to withdraw. He saw that he was tired and still didn't let him get off the treadmill. So it was the researcher's fault, and he has to take responsibility for those actions. And this can cause the researcher to be fined, have legal action taken against him, because obviously the child sustained an injury where the researchers made him do exercise. So it will most likely lead to him getting either sued or suspended because of the actions taking place. So, moving on to respect. Respect must be shown by the research participant. As we can see in scenario 2, the participant is quite clearly disrespected. The researcher tells him to stop being such a girl's blouse and that he should be doing better than he is. This is disrespectful of the child's right to withdraw, and using language like this can cause emotional harm to the child. The researcher needs to respect 5 things for the participant, and these are their anxieties, choices, performances, knowledge, dignity. As we can see, the participants' choices were not respected when they were made to carry on. Their performance was not respected as they were called a girl's blouse and should be doing better than this. And finally, their dignity was also not respected as they fell off the back of the equipment at the end. So, in turn, that's if people found out about the researcher disrespecting the child, then it would lead to them being suspended or having their BASES accreditation taken away because of the ethical problems that presents. They're not going to want researchers that disrespect the participants when they're researching into different things. And also the consequences for the participant are that they probably feel emotional harm, psychological harm because of the way they were treated, and it's not a nice experience to be verbally abused and then falling off a treadmill and hurting yourself. So moving on to equality and impartiality. The researchers have an ethical obligation to uphold equality and impartial decisions when testing and collating data. As we can see, after running short on the time, the researcher needs to get the data quickly, so decides to choose the better boys to use. Not only is this not collating completely correct results because only a small sample of people are used, it is disregarding the girls who will be tested. This is a sexist approach to getting the testing done and is based on stereotypes that boys are more athletic and will bring better results. And also the non-better boys will feel left out and hurt by the decision not to choose them instead of the others, and it's not proving correct data because you're choosing a small sample size of people that you think are going to do better. So the results are going to be you're not going to have varying results. You're going to have one set of results that don't show the general public's sort of results. And so this can cause. This is obviously an ethical issue because he's not choosing participants equally, and he's not choosing with impartial choice. So it means that he will be suspended if the researcher, sorry, will be suspended because it's not within the BASES guidelines. He probably have his accreditation stripped BASES. He may be let go from his job. And so on. And the consequences for the other participants are that they will feel psychological harm or emotional harm from not being picked, and maybe self-conscious of the fact that they're not one of the better boys. So moving on to debriefing. A debriefing is a summary at the end of the testing that gives information to the participant, reinforcing and informing them of what was recorded during the session and how it will be used. A debriefing will include talking about the well-being of the participant, a discussion of their experience, information about the testing and where the data may be used. A debriefing was not used in the scenario, leaving the participants unsure of what they have contributed and where their data will be used in the future. And this is obviously a problem because also the Data Protection Act of 1998 says that you need to have consent to use the data, and even though a debriefing may not have covered this, it would have helped. But without asking for the data, he's taken the data, and this means consequences will be a suspension. He may be fired. He may have his BASES accreditation stripped because, once again, he's not following the guidelines of BASES. Moving on to scenario 3, which is the scenario that I created. So a researcher wants to measure a group of boys and girls' blood lactate levels after performing a series of squats for 4 minutes, so anaerobic exercise. The children are aged 12 to 14. The researcher has created an informed consent form that was given out before the trip took place. This includes the right to publish the data. The testing begins immediately with the boys being split from the girls. Everyone completes the test twice with a 1 minute rest in between. After the last person finishes the exercise, the researcher finds out that he has run out of blood samplers. He uses one that has just been previously used on another person. After the testing is finished, one of the participants passes out. They later find that their blood pressures are extremely high and was raised further by the nature of the exercise. After the testing is finished, the researcher debriefs all of the participants. So, good practice. Informed consent was made, and subject disclaimer was given to the children before the testing was carried out. Debrief was also given at the end. So obviously, informed consent, that's good because they know what was going to happen in the session, and they gave their consent on what was going to happen. Subject disclaimer. This means that they were told what was going to happen before, so they were going to be pricked with a blood sampler that would take blood, and it may hurt, and they're all okay with that. And a debrief was also given at the end, so they were asked how they felt, how was their experience, so on. So I'll move on to the pool practice. A risk assessment is a live document that is put in place to prevent injury and hazards happening to participants in a certain area. The document needs to be updated so that their new equipment has controls in place to prevent injury and so on. There was no risk assessment in place for this session, although it was not necessary for the exercise being done. It is still required. There are always hazards in an area, and the consequences for a researcher, if there isn't a hazard, isn't a risk assessment in place, and someone does get hurt, is that they will be fined, and then they're not working within the guidelines of the BASES Code of Conduct, which means, and the health and safety procedures, that you're not working within those because you don't have a risk assessment in place to prevent certain hazards happening, and it could potentially be dangerous. So, subject disclaimer. Having a subject disclaimer means that you disclose any information needed to the participants before any of the testing begins so that they can give informed consent and the researcher avoids accusations of deception. In this case, the participants need to be aware that they will be pricked with a needle and have blood drawn. This needs to be okay with the participant as some people may not be comfortable with. So, test sequence. So test sequence involves how the testing is laid out. It involves things such as order of testing, rest time, and familiarization. In this scenario, the researcher gets the children to go straight into the exercise. In other tests, the researcher may allow time to get familiar with the nature of the test before taking part in the actual thing. After the first test, the children are required to complete the second test straight away, allowing no time for recovery, and meaning they will be tired after the first test. It is an anaerobic and is meant to raise the blood lactate levels in the body to see how the exercise affects these levels in the body. This means that the second set of data for all of the participants is going to be less accurate because they're already fatigued and they haven't had enough time to rest. There is no real massive consequences for either, although for the consequences for the participant, they may feel fatigued and tired after the exercise. But for the researcher, it's mainly just to get the correct results, and the consequences would be having less accurate data to use. So scientific misconduct. Sorry. Researchers have a priority to keep the participants safe and also to keep up their commitment to bases and so on. In this scenario, the children are having blood taken. When the researcher runs out of the blood sample, he uses one that's just been used on another participant. This means that the participant may be infected with a disease, or they can contract any number of health-threatening viruses, disease or conditions. And obviously this is a problem because he's not followed health and safety procedures where you've obviously got to have clean equipment to use when taking blood, and causing infection that could cause health-threatening things for a child. And that means that in the future, if they do decide to press charges, then he might have a tribunal taken against him because it's serious. There's serious consequences for not having clean equipment. He may have his basis accreditation stripped because obviously he's not been working within the guidelines. He's suspended. He might have to be supervised if he is able to keep his job. Supervised because to make sure he does not do it again. So moving on to my last one for this is health screening. So the participants that partake in testing must have a health screening before they participate to see if they will have any issues while participating. In this scenario, we can see that a health screening would have been essential for the health of the participants, as a researcher would have found that they had high blood pressure and would have avoided potential issues involving the test for this individual. So at the end of the scenario, we see that someone passes out, and this means that there was no health screening in place to make sure that they wouldn't, to make sure that they are okay with the testing. And this is an example of how important a health screening test is before the testing actually happens, to make sure that if someone does have a problem that's going to be affected by the testing, then they can sit out or they can be referred to a doctor before the testing actually happens. And obviously in this scenario that didn't happen and someone fainted, and this could cause a number of problems with high blood pressure. So the consequences for the researcher once again are suspended, tribunal formed, legal action taken if the person decides to press charges, definitely stripped of their basis accreditation because they haven't followed the guidelines. Once again, they haven't followed the health and safety procedures that are in place to stop that from happening. And then it actually did happen where someone had a problem and they passed out because of the nature of the testing. So finally, moving on to the risk assessment. This is an example of a risk assessment that might have been used, and I've got an example at the top here. So potential hazards, spread of disease, who is at risk, participant, existing control measures, so use new equipment per person, risk rating is 3 because it's severe. Preventable measures is make sure the sampler is new so that you're not contaminating people with other blood, and then the responsibilities is by the researcher, has the responsibility to keep this thing clean. The risk assessment needs to be updated the risk assessment needs to be updated regularly as well, so that new equipment and stuff like that has controls in place to stop people from being hurt and so on.